Alright guys, we're back to looking at period 1. Specifically today we're looking at topic 1.5, which is titled Labor, Slavery, and Caste in the Spanish Colonial System. We're going to work on period 1 from AP US History Curriculum. So the overall learning objective for this particular topic states that we need to be able to explain how the growth of the Spanish Empire in North America shaped the development of social and economic structures over time. So we need to first get kind of a sense of place. And when we're talking about the Spanish Empire in North America, we're looking basically at all of this. So this would be the work of the conquistadors we were looking at earlier in a previous video. Cortez and Pizarro and so forth. They've built this vast empire going all the way from modern-day California down to modern-day Argentina and Chile. And so let's look at some historical developments related to this. Our first one states that in the Comiendo system, Spanish colonial economies marshaled Native American labor to support plantation-based agriculture and extract precious metals and other resources. So in Comiendo, we've looked at this earlier this year, and Comiendo is this, against a labor system designed by the Spanish to take advantage of existing laborers, that is to say Native Americans, in their empire. And so the way this worked in general was that the Spanish authorities would grant these very large tracts of land to Spanish colonists. And on the land, of course, were Native Americans. And these Native Americans kind of came with the land. The Spanish were supposed to kind of oversee these Indians, and they were responsible for Christianizing them. So this goes back to the God, glory, and gold. This is obviously God. That aspect of it, where we're trying to convert the natives to Catholicism specifically. Now, this is a system that's obviously ripe with all kinds of abuse, or at least potential for abuse, because the Spanish authorities are way across the Atlantic. It's hard to really enforce their decrees, because the natives were not supposed to be harmed, but in practice, many of them were. They're subjected to some pretty brutal labor forces, whether that's working on plantations or in the silver and gold mines. Life was not easy under the Comiendo system for most Native Americans. Speaking of labor, our next development states that European traders partnered with some West African groups who practiced slavery to forcibly extract slave labor for the Americas. The Spanish imported enslaved Africans to labor in plantation agriculture and mining. So when that development refers to the West African groups, we're talking about groups right along here on West Africa, where, as you can tell, the vast majority of the transatlantic slave trade originated. So we have groups along the coast who are engaged in the slave trade. So they would basically be the suppliers. They would bring slaves in from the interior along the coast here, and they would meet on the coast. European traders would arrive. They would basically exchange European goods for the slaves. So they get the European goods they don't have access to otherwise. They get laborers for the empire in the Americas. Again, this empire that's developing the Americas can't rely on Native American labor forever. The main reason, of course, is disease. The disease is running rampant, brought over by the Europeans in the Columbian Exchange, and so another labor force needs to be found, and that labor force was African slaves. And the conditions for these slaves were, as you can imagine, brutal, particularly in the sugar plantations that are going to develop in the Caribbean, as pictured over here. This is just hard physical labor in the intense sun and heat and humidity of the Caribbean. There's no hope really for a better future. This is the beginnings of chattel slavery, a topic we'll get into later. And slavery will exist not just in the Caribbean. You'll see pockets of it in the Spanish Empire throughout. Our next learning objective states that the Spanish developed a caste system that incorporated and carefully defined the status of the diverse population of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans in their empire. So we've seen this graph earlier this year. This is a basic layout of the Spanish colonial society. At the bottom, you of course have the workforce, your enslaved Africans we just talked about, and the Native Americans themselves. Above them you have a group called mulattoes, above them mestizos, above them the Creoles, and at the very top the Peninsulares. So we're going to work our way backwards on this and look at the Peninsulares first. The Peninsulares were Spanish. They were from Spain. Okay, the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, in other words. That's where the name Peninsulares comes from. So these people are 100% Spanish. They come from Spain, and they have the authority in the New World Empire. Now, beneath them are a group called the Creoles. The Creoles are, just like the Peninsulares, 100% Spanish. The difference is they were born in the New World, not the Old World. And so as a New Worlder, you're going to be one step down on the ladder of the social structure. Now, beneath the Peninsulares and the Creoles would be your mestizos. And your mestizos, it's really, honestly, it's a creation of this Colombian exchange in the sense that mestizos are people with a blended ancestry. So they are partly Native American, partly European. So a Spanish colonist would come over, he might marry a native woman, they have a child, that child is mestizo, which, again, a blended ancestry. Beneath the mestizo would be another group of people with a blended ancestry. This would be your mulattoes. Now, in this case, it's not European and Native American, it's going to be European and African. The mulattoes. Notice how they are above the bottom of the group, but they're not obviously as higher up either. So they're kind of in the middle, the lower middle, we might say, of the Spanish colonial society. Again, the key here is a new blended culture, something that never existed before in history. And the mestizos, of course, if you look at if you look at Latin America today, the vast majority of people in Latin America would identify as mestizo, partly European, partly Native American. So that was a quick review of topic 1.5, labor, slavery, and caste in the Spanish colonial system. We looked at the transatlantic slave trade briefly, where the West African groups were sending slaves over, sent over, of course, on European ships. The Europeans themselves are buying these slaves from the Africans, and the slave labor force will be used for agriculture and mining. We looked at the Comiendo system as well with the Native Americans, and this new blended culture made up with a very strict social structure or caste system in New Spain.